I would like to welcome everyone to a brown bag lunch lecture at the Old State House Museum. We're going to do that virtually today. We're so happy to have our very special guest. It's been a long time trying to get this man to talk for us, and it's going to be an amazing thing. A couple of notes. If anyone has a question, I would rather you just put a question mark or type your question into the chat sequence. So if you'd rather me ask the question of Dr. Beaupre, I will read it from the chat. But if you'd rather want to come on and say live your own question, just put a question mark there and we'll wait till, like I said, he takes a break, a little bit of a breath in between sentences, and I'll ask him if he's ready to take questions about that particular part of what he's talking about. We're going to hold all the statements, I think. If you just want to make a statement, let's hold that to the very end. He's got a lot of wonderful information. It's going to be hitting us really quick with it. So it's going to be a lot of fun. We do, like I said, anticipate questions, and we'll do our best to seamlessly work those into the conversation. And this man is so knowledgeable. I think you're all going to be very, very surprised with how much information you're going to learn, even though you may have known a thing or two about this subject. Production notes as far as the Old State House goes, we're looking to do more of this type and then maybe an amalgamated version of a live small audience and a virtual component moving forward with our lunch lectures. We're going to get those back up running. I feel good and strong about that. And so welcome everyone. It's 12:01. I don't have to introduce this man too much, but this is Dr. Andrew Beaupre, and he's stationed at Pine Bluff. Am I correct? But
absolutely.
A little bird told me that he's covering about 4 different archaeological sites for us as the state. So I know the man's always out there busy, and he's got his sidekick with him. His business partner today is a 7-month-old. And so if at any one time he bends out of frame, don't freak out about it. He's just having to do his daddy duties, right?
Absolutely. And thank you. I appreciate you that. That was a little surprise for us. My sister had a family emergency, so.
Hey, it is what it is, man, and we're all friends and colleagues together, and we're just happy to be a part of it. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and turn that over to Dr. Beaupre. Thank you, sir, for joining us.
Well, thank you, and thank you very much for the opportunity. It has been about a year coming. We had this scheduled for last archaeology month, last March, and then the pandemic hit, so everything shut down. So what I want to do today is just kind of give you all a brief snapshot of where we are with French colonial archaeology in the state of Arkansas currently, and kind of my plans going forward for the future. And so there's like Daniel mentioned, there's an awful lot of information, so I'm going to try and give it to you in little snippets. But just kind of an overall view for you. This is your kind of, I call it the middle school textbook version of French colonial history in North America. And so you have what we call the Big Blue Crescent. And so where English colonial settlement all the way up through the Revolution is really like smashed in here on the coast. What we call French colonial interaction kind of goes all the way around in this blue crescent view. This just happens to be a French language version of this map. There's an English language one out there as well. Which you can see, it's I think the first thing when you Google French colonial America or something, it pops up. Really interesting thing about it is it's used by everybody and their brother out there in presentations internationally, and it's incorrect, which is kind of fun. You can see this Fort Rosalie star here is in the middle of Louisiana. Fort Rosalie is actually over here in Mississippi. So this map has been reproduced dozens and dozens of times, and I love to show some of my colleagues that. They're like, what? How is that possible? But anyway, what I wanted to do here is just zoom in a little bit on where we are and French interaction in Arkansas. Because a lot of people don't even think about the fact that, French colonization happened this far kind of out in the middle of nowhere, if you will, in the 17th and 18th century. And really, 17th century is just so crazy early when we're talking about American history in general. And so to have Arkansas Post really settled in 1686 to begin with is kind of fascinating. And so I'm going to walk you through some of that. But what I really want you to start paying attention to and kind of the underlying discussion about not just French colonialism in Arkansas, but across the country is this idea of a tie to the rivers. And so the way that French colonization and exploration is really happening is via the waterways. And this is kind of the 19th century romantic image we have here of the betuqued voyageur exploring in his canot. This is what we call a canot Montréal, a smaller Montreal canoe, or they get bigger, la canot du Nord. It's like huge. They'll get, 30, 40 feet long and 6 feet wide in the middle, and a whole bunch of paddlers going at it when the fur trade gets really big. But this kind of romantic image of the paddler either poling over the rapids or shooting the rapids is kind of like the Canadian cowboy image. So it's the same kind of fanciful idea that grabs imagination of children all the way up through adults. And this idea of, so like the Western movie genre really started with these voyageur kind of fur trapper movies. Interesting enough, because by that time Canadian history had shifted over to being Anglo-centric and the Queen being in charge, a lot of the French Canadians are evil in those movies. Really fascinating. They're always the bad guy. They're like the Snidely Whiplash with the mustache and the whole it's always a dirty Frenchman who is somehow evil. But we're talking about the other side of that. Another one of my underlying themes is to kind of correct this Anglo-centric view of North American history where everything has to be English, 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 either language or culture or identity and idea. And so I'm always kind of combating that too. But anyway, where I had recently done work was up in the Northeast. And so I moved here in August of 2019 from right about here, actually, right where that first 3 is, a town called Hyde Park. But my dissertation research had been on these riverine forts of the Northeast. And so moving that kind of idea and discussion of a river landscape and the way that the French are exploring to Arkansas is kind of my research goals now. So I really want to focus in on the big site that everyone knows about, which is Arkansas Post. And so we can't talk about Arkansas Post and the history of Arkansas and Western Mississippi without discussing the fact that Arkansas Post existed and currently does exist on traditional Quapaw lands. I have the Quapaw flag there as the backdrop. And then you thought that Arkansas Post is actually not one place. Something else to really remember. It's at least 5 forts in at least 3 locations. And I say at least because we don't have concrete archaeological evidence of all of them yet. And so we're going to talk about a little bit of that. Another interesting thing to think about with French archaeology in Arkansas is that it begins very much under the French imperial flag, right? Henri de Tonty in 1686 founds the original Arkansas Post. It's French, and it's French as in the French crown exists, right? You move forward, and the second Arkansas Post, we think at the same location, still imperial French, right? Third Arkansas Post, still under the French crown. Well, then when we move down to the fourth Arkansas Post, it starts as French, and then after the 7 Years' War, after the French and Indian War, the actual ownership of the territory becomes Spanish. Now, it's Spanish colonial government. The rule of government is a little different, but the people aren't all of a sudden Spanish, right? They're all still French speaking, and the Creole dialect is still based in very much in French and native interaction. And so while it's under a different flag, it's still kind of French culturally. Post moves one more time, is Spanish still, is French under Napoleon for a hot minute after the Revolution, and then Louisiana Purchase and Arkansas Post becomes the first capital of the Arkansas Territory and an American town, if you will. Another little interesting tidbit that happens with the clash of Anglocentrism and Franco-American stuff right there at Arkansas Post at that moment in time. But I want to watch through each of these sites in a little bit more detail, tell you where we are historically and archaeologically. I'll say it again at the end, but I'll say it right here to begin with. This map is actually courtesy of my good buddy, Judge Morris Arnold. And he was one of the first people I met when I moved here, actually, as someone who's very interested in French Arkansas. The benefit of a relationship with a serious historian who is focused on the exact same topic you are is unfathomable in my work. A lot of historical archaeologists like me have to play both roles, have to spend hours and hours and hours in the archives, digging through dusty documents and getting paper cuts. which I always pick on my historian friends as like the biggest threat in their existence. I have to deal with snakes and alligators and they get paper cuts. But anyway, the idea that the judge has already spent so much of his own time going through these documents, compiling and writing amazing books about the topic, I can go to his books and reference things that I want to tie in the archaeology to, or I can pick up the phone and call Buzz, which is just amazing. And so that I have to thank him just so much for that relationship. And so a lot of my work is built on his historical work that I'm just kind of adding and tacking the archaeology into and kind of making it, we talk about it being a fuller version of history. When you can tie history and archaeology together, it's a fuller version of the past that we can get a more nuanced idea of what it was like. So anyway, 1686, I want to talk about the first Arkansas post. A couple of really interesting characters come up in the history of French and Arkansas. This guy, Henri de Tonty, is La Salle's right-hand man in this exploration of what would become known as the Pays d'Anneau, or the Upper Country, the Great Lakes region, and everything kind of west of the Mississippi. He gets this title of the Upper Country, which kind of means like over there, way out there. De Tonty is a really interesting character himself. He's a career soldier. He has a hook for a hand, which is just kind of cool. Like when you talk about it, he had a hand blown off in a battle, I think it's in Italy, by a hand grenade. Let's just think about that. 17th century, his hand's blown off by a grenade. And he just still lives his life and goes exploring. Fascinating. Anyway, he is given the personal grant of the area around the Arkansas River by La Salle, because La Salle was given a grant to everything to trade this side of the Mississippi. And so Tonty is given a personal grant by La Salle to set up the city of Tonty along the Arkansas River. Now, maybe a little grandiose to call it a city. When it's founded, it's like 6 guys in a single log cabin. But hey, it's there. It's that first Arkansas post that exists. It's the first kind of footprint of French colonization in North America. And so, again, without the association with the local Quapaw people, that ain't happening, right? And so there's got to be a direct tie. Now, this is an example of one of our field maps of the area that we assume that was originally Tonty's post. Now, this is, I'm drawing on work of my predecessor, Dr. John House here at the UAPB station, but there's a number of archaeological sites that are all clumped together, and we assume that that area is actually where the original Arkansas post of Tonty was built. Close in association to the village of Osatoy, the Quapaw village of Osatoy, and really near the Menard Mound Complex, which is a very famous archaeological site. Now, this is all National Park Service territory, and also some of it's owned by U.S. Fish and Wildlife, and it's all protected, which is amazing for me as an archaeologist. That means that no one's going to go out there and dig and destroy an archaeological site, and I know that it's safe, because archaeology really just isn't about the stuff, isn't about the artifacts. We'll talk more about that in a little bit too, but it's about the context and how all the clues fit together. It's much more like a crime scene investigation than it is just treasure hunting. And so I think now more people are understanding that with shows like Bones and CSI, where the crime scene is the thing. And archaeology is very much like that. We have to take the whole picture into account. And in this case, there are numerous archaeological sites that, when we piece the evidence together, tell us this is probably the location of Tonty's original post. Now, this is what Menard Mounds Complex looks like. It's inside what we call the Osatoy unit for the National Park Service. It's administered out of the Arkansas Post National Memorial, but it's not there. It's further down the river. And this is actually a picture of my colleague, Dr. Bob Scott, down here. And we, as the Arkansas Archaeological Survey, aid the National Park Service in preservation of this property by doing any sort of archaeological testing that's required in the area during, if there's a storm, say, and there's tree roots thrown up, or there's sign of hogs has been an issue, right? Now the site is protected from looting, so we try to make sure that there's no one out there digging potholes and looking for artifacts, and that's patrolled by the National Park Service as well, so we know that's relatively safe. But the hogs, they work at night. So that's that can be an option. That can be a serious concern. But that work of this original Arkansas post has been published. This is a forthcoming article by my predecessor, Dr. House, about contact era graves. The other thing when we're considering archaeology is it might not just be habitation sites, but there could be remains of human beings. And in that case, there's federal law that kicks in about that. And in this case, his project at the Lac du Mont site was what we assume to be contact era Native American graves. And he worked in concert with the Quapaw over that project to make sure that there was no kind of political concerns that come up, because quite frankly, people are concerned when you excavate their ancestors. I think that's completely fair. As archaeologists, there's more than just data. There's the anthropological view we have to make sure that you include descendant communities in discussions of their own archaeological past. Then, you know, it's not just the grave good idea and the graves, but also the material culture. And so when we shift to thinking about the history of the site and thinking to more the archaeology, we can find some really interesting little tidbits. And this is another byline of an article that was written by my predecessor on the Wallace Bottom site, which is actually where we believe the original Arkansas post was in 1686. And just neat little things like this green glazed ceramic is just kind of like the utilitarian ware of the 17th and 18th century. It's like the coffee mug, if you will. I mean, it could be made into a coffee mug or a pitcher like this, but it's just the kind of everyday go to the kitchen cupboard and grab your dishes type of ware. And we can see that that was being brought in and used by the French people. It's really kind of indicative of French colonization, is this very bright green lead glazeware. Now, the work is still ongoing. And so this is actually a snapshot of a proposal I sent to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife that controls part of this property to get bones analyzed. In this case, not human bone, but these are animal bones. And so I'm working right now with a good friend of mine, Dr. Terry Martin at the Illinois State Museum, who is a zooarchaeologist. And that means that he studies animal remains and attempt to understand how those animal remains, we can use them as archaeologists to understand how people ate. What animals are they eating? Are they indicative more of domestic, an idea of brought in European style foods? Or are they eating native foods? Are they cooking it in a European fashion? Or are they cooking it in a more native fashion? You can tell by butchering that way, that kind of thing. This kind of work, incredibly, I don't call it tedious, but yeah, I'm gonna call it tedious. I don't have the attention span for this kind of thing. But you can see here, this is a lunch tray from a cafeteria, because, you know, we use high quality specialty goods. But that is bone fragment. That is all from an archaeological site, what we call a feature, which means it was probably a fire pit in the past where people were cooking and just kind of chucking the bones in the fire pit. And so all of those are sorted through to find out clues about what was being eaten and how it was being cooked. Really interesting stuff. So that work is ongoing. This is just an initial report I just got from Dr. Martin about what we've got so far. We're seeing possum, we're seeing squirrel, we're seeing things that are also indicative of Europeans bringing food in. There's no cattle here in 1686 or even in the second fort in 1721. The French had to import cows, right? There's bison, and there's an indication that the local people are eating bison as well, but they're also bringing in European style animals. The pig is not quite wild yet at the time either, so that's kind of an interesting discussion as to where that goes. Domestic chicken, that kind of thing. Yes, sir.
All right, so got a question. What is the most exciting find for you personally at this site?
You know, for me personally, it's the specific French ceramics, because those don't lie. Those are coming in that are really indicative of, hey, this is more than likely the French habitation site. Now, that having been said, it could have been brought in by native people, but the trick is native people in the early contact period, and this is speaking from a lot of my work in the Great Lakes, not crazy about European ceramics. Why? They already have their own ceramics. They make their own pots. If you're going to trade with somebody, you want something new, different, cool, not something that you can make yourself, right? So by showing us kind of utilitarian French wares, also not pretty ceramics, more than likely it means that there are French people there using them. There's, you know, native pottery that work just as well and actually better for native style cooking and eating than the European pottery stuff coming in. Other classes of goods, you know, gun parts, things like that, they're traded openly back and forth between natives, so it's not really as indicative as a French domestic site. So that's kind of exciting to me. Moving on to the second Arkansas post, same location. Don't know as much about that archaeologically. That's our second kind of crazy character. John Law was a Scottish-born financier banker who somehow became the head banker under the Regent Crown of France. And he kind of orchestrated a subprime mortgage deal. And he was really good at manipulating markets and selling stocks. And selling stocks for companies that didn't quite yet exist or didn't have any dividends whatsoever. And so he ended up not doing so well in the end. But he consolidated the monopoly of trade charters. And so he had the charter for a while for the company, which was a really big deal. You could control a trade in an area. So he set up the second Arkansas post. Originally, he was going to bring in a whole bunch of Germans to farm the area because the thought was if you come from Germany or what we call the Low Countries, so Belgium and the Netherlands, you were a better farmer than the local French people who had gone native too much. They weren't really good farmers. It was a kind of the political idea of the 18th century. And so this very kind of aristocratic Scottish French guy was like, I'm going to bring in, I don't want the locals to farm my land. I want to build an agricultural colony. I want good farmers to come from Europe. Colony never really got off the ground. A post was built to defend the colony that never really existed. And then it was actually burned down as part of the French-Chickasaw War in 1749. So we have a firm date of when that post no longer existed. Now, archaeologically, not a lot of an imprint to that one. The site at Wallace Bottom that's turning up some of those French indicative ceramics could be one or the other of the posts, could be the first Arkansas post or the second one. They're only separated by about 40, 50 years. And sometimes in material culture studies, it's not really clear where that goes. Excuse me. Also, the Wallace Bottom site has a small amount of excavation. If we could end up digging there a bit more, expanding that excavation and hopefully figuring out some more of those pieces, find more temporally specific artifacts that are going to help with that. So after second Arkansas post goes down at the hands of the Chickasaw, bring back that theme about existing because the Quapaw existed. The Quapaw had already moved away when Law's colony was planning on coming in. They moved up to an area that was called Ekkofouge, or the Red Bluffs, where the National Post Memorial is right now, Arkansas Post National Memorial is right now. So once the Chickasaw came in and burned down the Arkansas Post because it wasn't very well defended, because there were no neighbors to protect the French were like, oh, well, we're going to move to where the Quapaw are because the neighbors will protect us. And so, boom, there we go, up to Arkansas Post at Ekkofouge. This is a later map from the 19th century, but we don't really know a lot about that first Arkansas post. We haven't found that first Arkansas post up at Ekkofouge. So that's actually the third post, but the first one in that National Memorial. We don't know a lot about it. The only thing we really know is from this map from 1832, which is, 80 years later, but there's this little note in the middle of the map that says there's a completely flooded point where the Spanish fort previously located. Now, this was written by a French priest who came to Arkansas Post in the 1830s. And we're assuming, I got this idea from Judge Arnold, that when he says Spanish fort, he doesn't really know what he's talking about. And that may be where the French built the first Arkansas Post at Ekkofouge on this point. Now, something else I've learned about living in Arkansas, being a new transplant, your rivers are aggressive and they move. Where I'm from, rivers are cut through granite. They don't move. They've been in the same spot for millennia, and they will be in the same spot, in a couple more millennia. They don't go anywhere. Down here, they wander all around. And in this case, it looks like that area is somewhere in this bend is probably where that point of the first post at Ekkofouge was. And you can see now this is a modern satellite imagery. Here's the National Memorial Park that's there. And we think that indicator of the old French-Spanish fort somewhere in here could have been blown away by the canal coming through. We don't really know. It's kind of gone. It might be, a lucky day with a shovel someday that we find something, but right now that's a site that we just assume is no good and is gone. Now, a little further on, you get to the fourth iteration of Arkansas Post. This one I find fascinating. This has a more kind of colloquial name of Fort Deshay, and it's way down. And the reason that they moved the Arkansas Post from Ekkofouge way up here where the National Memorial is now, all the way down on the river past where it once was, more toward the Mississippi, was that they were on the eve of war. 7 Years' War is coming up, the French and Indian War, and the French government says, well, if we're going to be having, these convoys coming up the Mississippi River, we have got to have the fort a lot closer to the Mississippi River. Kind of going and taking a 40-mile detour up to Arkansas Post is going to waste too much time. So instead, we're going to move Arkansas Post closer to the Mississippi. So they up and moved the whole fort. And when they did that, the the governor's wife, when he talks about she calls it the most miserable and disagreeable hole in the universe. If you ever go up to the Arkansas Post National Memorial, it's rather nice. It's a bluff overlooking the river. You get a breeze off the river. It's lovely. Fort Deshay is generously a swamp. Even now, it is a backwater in the middle of nowhere. We'll talk more about that. There is nothing going on down there. And so there was nothing going on down there in 1780, and there's nothing going on down there now. It's very much Delta. The site, we have some neat archaeological history. The site was first recorded by an expedition coming to map the mounds that are all around the Mississippi and Arkansas rivers. And so when this expedition from the Smithsonian came in the 1870s, 80s, they saw clearly European-style earthworks, and they're like, oh, there had to have been a fort here. We don't know much about it. We're going to call it Fort Deshay because it's in, Deshay County area, so it's Fort Deshay. We have it mapped on this is again our map of where the site is located. And the concern with that is that, again, we talk about those moving rivers. The site was brought to the attention of the survey by a local collector, a guy by the name of Harvey McGee, in the 1960s, I believe, is when he first brought it to the attention of the survey. He was an artifact collector, and he was out there finding artifacts from the French period just kind of on the surface. Now, really interesting thing about that is that we discourage that kind of, we call it looting. And as archaeologists, because we want to collect all the data that we can in that crime scene fashion, we discourage things that we term as looting. Now, in actuality, sometimes we really need to work with people who are artifact collectors because they can show us where sites are. They know where the good spots are, if you will, and they can show us where to find decent archaeological remains that we can hopefully explore more in a scientific fashion. Now, he brought that to the attention of one of my predecessors. One of them had access to a small plane, Cessna-style plane, flew over the site. There's this thin peninsula of land sticking out in the river. Really cool, right? It was even then, when this picture was taken in the 70s, it was a really kind of remote area. Well, it still is a remote area, like I mentioned, but where it was sitting on the edge of this peninsula here, what didn't really make a lot of sense to my predecessors is that, we talked about this being the front of the fort that was survived, and the back of the fort had been blown away by the river. Well, that didn't make a lot of sense because in our experience, French forts, because everybody's paddling down the river, French forts are oriented toward the river. The front door is usually at the river because that's where everybody's coming from. Nobody's coming in from the land, right? Well, you think about those moving rivers again, we start looking at historic maps, right? Here's a location as it was in 72 on the map. You go back into 1939, here's that same geographic location, but that peninsula of land is much wider because the river is further north. It hasn't eaten away all of this yet, right? So you can see, oh, well, the front would have been from the south because that would have been a nice sandbar, a nice access to it, a nice kind of walking up to the fort in the 30s here. And this actually map includes a meander from the 1830s as well. You can see that even gets closer to kind of the front door aspect of the fort. Now, here is a modern satellite imagery or vector map of what that site looks like today. Notice the peninsula that Fort Deshay is on. It ain't there, right? It's gone. And so when you look at the satellite map, we assume the fort is somewhere. I've dropped the pin on land over here. We assume Fort Deshay is somewhere in here. This is actually the road that was used by my colleagues. The last people to visit the site was survey archaeologists in the 80s. And just before the last flood just took this entire peninsula off. So we assume that the site is really completely gone. Now, somewhere in that area, there may be remains that if the river was nice and left anything for us, but we doubt it. The benefit of this is that Mr. Mcgee's collection lives on. He, as far as I understand, he kept some of it in his own private collection, but he donated a great deal of it. The best collection of French colonial artifacts that are on display anywhere right now in Arkansas is at the Deshay County Museum in Dumas. So if anybody's up for a little adventure, go down there. Really neat county museum. Very sweet ladies, love it. They run it rather. This is there's a case of French artifacts in the back, one of the back pole barn rooms or back pole barn buildings, and there's a whole case of these that I'm hopefully going to sign an agreement to borrow and to study at some point. But right now they're on display and they're just kind of there without a lot of interpretation. It's neat to see, you know, really these French artifacts that are nowhere else like that in the state. We do have some in our collection that were either donated or found episodically that are associated with Fort Deshay from the visits by my previous predecessors, but really the big collection is in Dumas. One of the pieces that was held into Mr. Mcgee's collection, I don't know if his family still has it, is a really interesting single artifact. And so somebody's talking about the most interesting artifact from a site. This is definitely the most interesting artifact from the Fort Deshay site. It's a little disc of lead. When I first saw it, I saw it just drawing, and you know, I know what it is immediately. But it's a really poor representation. It's hard to see. I don't even know what that is from the sketch, right? Well, I was lucky enough to dig back in our records and find a slide that was taken when Mr. Mcgee brought the collection to be studied by one of my predecessors. And so when you turn that slide into an actual digital image, this is what you get. This is what's called a lead seal, often referred to as a bale seal, but probably more accurately referred to as a fabric or a bolt seal. What it was is when bolts of fabric, big chunks of fabric were brought in, they were measured as by the guilds that created them in France or in Europe in general. And then they were sealed with either wire or string and these wax ties so that no one would steal any of the fabric, or that they would, you know, they would have a whole kind of like inventory tag attached to them. And so we can tell from this one here, it's got 17.5 un, and that's an un is actually, it's like a yardage measurement of fabric that comes from Europe. And interestingly as well, with Judge Arnold's work on the topic, we have seen that some of the soldiers at the Arkansas post, when it was at Fort Deshay, were actually paid in fabric. And they had access to fabric because then they could trade that with local native peoples, as opposed to having money. Money's not going to do you much if no one is interested in buying the money, right? It's only worth what you can get for it. And so if the soldiers were paid or brought in and given fabric to exchange for their own livelihood with the local native population, it was a much more effective way of existing in a trade and barter exchange economy. Here's another photo of that. This is the backside, and there's a stamp. You can see the blow up of it. There's a stamp that could be initials or of the house that either like the guild that inspected the fabric or somebody who imported it. Those are always kind of interesting little things. But the seal itself, I had it analyzed by one of my former students, who is now one of the world's kind of specialists in lead seals. We have a tendency to get really pigeonholed in archaeology, and she went way down that rabbit hole. And so any of these more things that are more specific, I bounce to her. She's finishing her PhD at William & Mary right now. But yeah, fascinating information as much as we can gather from a single artifact, right? So we assume if there's anything left from Fort Deshay, it'll be somewhere in this red circle. I decided I was going to go look for it. I still am planning to do that. I had a date picked out. It's not an easy trip to get to. It's all private property. It's not allowed to be trespassed upon. It's owned by a paper company. I gained access to it, was allowed to go in to do my search. And the day that I was supposed to go and do this, I ended up spending all of the time at another fort in my front yard, because that's when we hit the snowstorm. And so my fellow Frenchman and I, who's very fond of the snow, born in the snows of Vermont, he was born in a snowstorm in January. And so like this kid, I mean, he just loves the snow. So anyway, we spent the time, I can't go find a French fort when it's under a foot of snow looking on the surface. So instead we built one in the front yard. That project is still ongoing. I plan to go out there and try and explore and find that. And then again, as long as I keep up the partnership with the owners of the property, something we're really big on.
Andrew, I got a question.
Kind of the final location of Arkansas. Yeah.
From a coin collector, have any French colonial coinage been found at any of these Arkansas Post locations?
Ooh, not to my knowledge, and that is not troublesome. There are some Spanish real coins that have popped up, I believe. And the trick with that is the Spanish were more into using specie, using coins, bringing in hard money. The French, a lot of that payment and exchange did happen, like I mentioned with the fabric. A lot of it happened in goods. Now, the soldiers would be tabulated, their pay would be tabulated in money, and it would be accounted for in money, but it would be paid in goods. Much easier to move, and then if no one is there to exchange the money with you, then if you're out at, say, like Arkansas Post, everything is coming in via shipment, right? And you're getting supplied at a post by the government. If whatever doesn't come on the boat, you have to find a way to get yourself, and you're not going to buy it from the native people with coinage because they don't want coinage necessarily. If they want coinage, they want it for decoration. They don't want it for its value. There's no intrinsic value in it for them, right? They want it for personal adornment or whatever, but you're not going to get the value of it as you would with anything else. It's just a trinket at that point. So it's much more common that the French were paid in goods in exchange. Coinage, the Spanish real, some of that comes in and goes. Oftentimes to collect wealth and show wealth, the officers would hold coinage, but it was rare, and as such, didn't get lost very much in deposition. So, very good question, though. Very good question. So up to the Arkansas Post National Memorial itself up there was Spanish, French again for a hot minute under Napoleon, then became American. The site, again, incredibly well protected. It is a national park. So anybody who goes and digs on the site without permission that's a crime. So they make sure that that doesn't happen. We as archaeologists still really interested in the site I still work with the National Park Service, do small excavations up there, but also looking at from a landscape point of view. My kind of specialty has been in landscape archaeology, and that's kind of a lot of why I use maps and things to show you my points. But so we have here a map of the way the town was said to be laid out when it was moved back in 1779, of laying out the village, having these settlements out here for habitants and for native people, as well as having this kind of sections or neighborhoods, if you will, of the village set up. If you haven't been, please go check this out. Arkansas Post National Memorial does a really great job of interpreting all of the posts, even though they weren't all there. And there's more to the history as well. There's the American town that comes up, the really kind of Federalist period expansion, territorial period of Arkansas town that's there. The Arkansas Gazette was founded there, oldest newspaper west of the Mississippi, right? There was a Civil War battle and the Civil War fort there. Civil War fort, remains of it are now under the river as well, given the damming and movement around the river and just the movement of the river. Funny story about that. I got a couple of minutes of sideline. I'll give you a quick story. My first visit to Arkansas Post, I was wandering around with one of the tour guides, and he mentioned that, we think that one of the Arkansas posts, meaning that first one that was the Spanish fort, was out there, and also the Civil War fort was out there in the river. And I was like, oh, well, this is no problem. I've done something similar in Michigan. That's not an issue at all. We just wait for the river to freeze, and we use ground penetrating radar over the ice as opposed to the soil. You can turn down the radar, you can fine tune it to find things underneath ice, not an issue. And the tour guide just looked at me, and I was like, oh, wait. River doesn't freeze here, does it? And he's like, no. Notice the alligator, the river doesn't freeze. And I was like, yeah, like northern thinking had to click out on that one. But anyway, and I'm not also fond of where I'm from, the lizards are this big. The little salamanders live under rocks. We don't have gators. So that has me a little nervous about going for a swim out there. But anyway, the site of the town itself, while it becomes this territorial capital of Arkansas Post, to notice that it's still very much a Creole town when it's founded and when it's lived in. It talks about the Arkansas Gazette here. This is their National Park Service map, but also individuals like Frederick Notrebe, who is this kind of second or third generation of an import individual who comes from France and sets up a kind of French imperial lifestyle on the frontier, another fascinating character in the history of Arkansas Coast. There's been a lot of archaeology that's been done at Arkansas Coast inside the park by the National Park Service, by the survey, by U of A, by other institutions. And so my step in my research process with this set of the sites is to really go through and read all these reports that were written, but also reanalyze the remains and try and figure out everything we can from previously excavated archaeology. I don't necessarily have to do new, but the way archaeology was interpreted in 1971 and the way it's interpreted in 2021 are completely different. And so oftentimes we can do the archaeology of archaeology, if you will, and look at the artifacts that were recovered, the reports that were done, and find a lot more information or different information than was discussed when they were originally analyzed in the 70s. Outside of that reanalysis, another really interesting thing about Arkansas Post and where we can go with it is what we call the Abitong Coast. This is that same map from 1832 by the French priest, whereas the village of Arkansas Post is off here to the west. Everybody, Notrebe included, had a country house, if you will. They had their plantation area, their farming area, which was much more akin to an habitant lifestyle. We talk about habitant is a French word meaning inhabitant. It was the word that was chosen by French settlers in North America as opposed to paysan, as opposed to being a peasant, because a peasant had like a pejorative connotation of being tied to the land, not really owning anything. When French farmers first came to the St. Lawrence Valley in Canada and started this French colonization movement in the early 1600s, they adopted the term habitant or inhabitant, which while they still didn't technically own the land, they were much more freehold farmers than peasants working for a feudal lord. And so that term of habitant has been attached to Arkansas Post as well at the Abitong Coast, where these farms were. And the French had a very particular way of cutting up agriculture into long lots where everybody got access to the river. So everybody had their own river port to move things farm to farm. And everybody's then land went backward from the river out into the bush. We can see the way that the maps have these section numbers still set up, are the original land grants that are still on the maps of this portion of Arkansas, right? So that French style of land and property landscape management is still present. And if you look at the modern property lines, they're still there. You know, those are the way that the properties are divvied up, which means that me as a landscape archaeologist can say, okay, you know, this area along where the river once was, that's your hotbed of location for possible French habitation sites, which is not the kind of fort military idea, but the individual homestead that's out there. One of those is recognized as a current archaeological site. It's also a park for the Army Corps of Engineers, which is, this is Notrebe Bend, because that's where Frederick Notrebe, this kind of headman of the village of Arkansas Post, had his farm outside of town. And they assume it's there. There's a site number for it, but there's not really archaeologically ground truth, which would be a really interesting project to go forward as well. One other kind of side note with Arkansas Post itself, when there's some really interesting documents from this period in 1820, 1819, when the Americans start showing up in force. So it had been a colonial town, kind of, you know, groovy and everybody getting along and speaking French and living a French lifestyle, meaning that they had a very different way of culturally doing things. And all of a sudden, all of these influx of Yankees, if you will, showed up from the East Coast to start land speculating west of the Mississippi. And so they moved in to Arkansas Coast and they brought the newspaper and they brought the banks and they brought this whole different way of doing things, very kind of American. We're going to build grids. We're going to build a grid system for a city. We're going to do this. We're going to do that. We're going to, oh, there's lawyers. There's a court here. We're going to have lots of lawyers. And the French were not happy with that. They wanted to live a little chill lifestyle, go hunt some things, go eat some things, not a big deal, right? So a lot of the French in the early American period between 1805, when the trade factory came in, they just up and left and built a new town of New Gascony, halfway between Little Rock and Arkansas Post. Gascony, of course, a French province. They just up and moved and were like, yeah, we're done. We're done with these Americans. Can't deal with them. We're going to go live our chill lifestyle out in the woods. Built another little town. And that colonial or early federal period New Gascony, that Creole town, has not been recorded archaeologically. So really looking forward to that, to hopefully finding that at some point too. There is an associated 19th century and early 20th century town of New Gascony, which is along the King Bayou, maybe somehow tied to this French colonization, but I'm thinking the French, that early kind of refugee community out of Arkansas Post would have been a little closer down to the river on these bluffs is my thought, but yeah, you never know. So getting out of just the Arkansas Post discussion, French colonial archaeology of Arkansas is a lot bigger than that, or French cultural archaeology, I guess, of Arkansas Post is a lot bigger than that. We have a lot of names of sites. And these are, we know a lot less about them archaeologically, and that's the focus of where I want to go on some. The exception that is probably Fort St. Francis up on the St. Francis River, which was occupied for a hot minute in the Second Chickasaw War. Here it is on a map from that period, the 1730s rather, and are the immediately past state archaeologist Dr. Ann Early had started doing some work on locating this. We believe it's located within the National Forest, which again is federal property, so it's protected. It can't be excavated without permits. So that's good idea. Hopefully, if we can find it and locate it, and then make sure it has further protections from erosions or things like that as well, if it still exists. So Dr. Early has written some things about it. There's a neat little article that appeared in our internal newsletter of Field Notes. She also wrote a chapter for an archaeological collective, edited volume on that work as well. So that's, we don't know exactly where it is. We have some documents on that. Looking forward to exploring that a little bit more. The Cadron Creek settlement, or the settlement up on the Cadron, is the idea is that it may somehow in the Cadron Ridge been associated with the French to begin with before American colonization came in. Not quite sure yet, but still kind of exploring that. And there's also the Concordia, or we call British Ozark, which is actually on the other side of the Mississippi, but a fascinating kind of history when the French and Spanish existed right up to the American Revolution. The British, who had control of this part of the Mississippi, part of Mississippi River and the Mississippi itself, set up a settlement in now the state of Mississippi on the east bank of the Mississippi River that they called British Ozark or Concordia. And they set it up to basically attack and harass the Spanish in Arkansas Post and along the Arkansas River, because the Spanish were going to side with the Americans in the Revolution, and the French sided with the Americans in the Revolution. And so the British wanted to harass the frontier as much as they could, actually sending out hunters to just kill everything and try and get it, making it a very difficult lifestyle for the people on the Arkansas River to exist if British hunters came in and just killed all of the animals. So it's almost like an economic warfare thing through the destruction of habitat. Really kind of interesting. Don't know where that site is. It probably is somewhere on Concordia Island, if it's still there, if the Mississippi has eaten it away. Yes, sir.
All right, so question from the gallery: would LiDAR be a good tool to use for finding these French forts, i.e. Fort St. Francis?
You know, it might be. If it's still there, it can be. So for users who don't know, is LiDAR is light detection and ranging. It's basically a laser that's shot down from a plane or a drone. Now you can do it from, and it makes an incredibly in-depth 3D map of the ground surface. It's been used most famously to locate like Mayan temples through jungle canopy, also to locate what we call hill forts or circle forts in the British countryside that have been plowed over and over and over and over for centuries, and it looks just like a flat field when you walk out there. But you look at it from the LiDAR from above and you can see the small changes in the kind of donut-shaped forts and things like that. It might be. I haven't looked into having that area overflown that way. There are some LiDAR images of the Mississippi Basin. They're not to the level that we would need Fort St. Francis, rather, was a very ephemeral existence. It didn't last very long, and it wasn't very large. And so it didn't have a lot of earthworks. It was probably pateau sur sol, or post in the ground. No, sorry, I said that wrong. Pateau en terre, post in the ground. Pateau sur sol is post on sill. Post in ground. And so it was, trench dug, walls built, flopped up, and dirt put back against the side. And actually the fort was then either burned down or dismantled, and the remains burned. When, as the Chickasaw War moved on, they decided that St. Francis wasn't the best place to be. So they just dismantled the fort, took a lot of the pieces to build another fort, and burned what was left. So it's tough when these sites are kind of basic and out there. The other thing I just want to hit, this is my last slide, but talking about the fact that French expansion and exploration happened all over Arkansas. And so, I mean, Little Rock is named after Le Petit Roche, right? And then the big rock across the river, La Roque Française. French exploration and that change has been left on the landscape. A lot of these names have stuck, whether they've been anglicized or not. My favorite is Smackover from Chemin Couvert. But, there's a lot more to this story than just Arkansas Post. And so while we know the most about Arkansas Post, it had been the focus of historical archaeology in Arkansas for a long time. There's a lot more to know. So I look forward to getting out there and looking out some more. Yeah, thank you very much for listening. What do you got, sir?
Could you tell us where the publications by Dr. Early regarding Fort St. Francis and the French Chickasaw War appear at? Where can we find those?
Yeah, absolutely. The one article that's really accessible is in what we call the field notes. It's our internal newsletter. The other one is on my bookshelf somewhere. It's in a book on the French and the Caribbean. It's right here. Lucky I'm in my home office that's here. It's in this book, French Colonial Archaeology in the Southeast and the Caribbean, by Ken Kelly and Meredith Hardy. It's available, U Florida Press. Anybody who's interested in French colonial archaeology in general, this is great because we like to talk about habitation and colonialization in this way in regions. Arkansas has been the focus of my work, mostly because I work for you all. I'm part of the Arkansas Archaeological Survey. I work for that, and my focus has been within the state of Arkansas. Now, of course, the term the state of Arkansas meant absolutely nothing to the people that I study, right? Didn't exist. There was no idea of it being bounded, but it's all about the interconnected ties between Arkansas Post, its smaller settlements like Cadron and other places, and places like Mobile, New Orleans, Pensacola, Florida, Fort Rosalie, Fort Natchez, all of these other things that are the tied sites together that are in multiple states now, but they're all in that southeast region. And then we tie it to the Caribbean because you have a large influx of these ships visiting the Caribbean and then coming up to New Orleans. And that happens all the way up through the 19th century as well. So yeah, definitely take a look if you're interested in a topic. And I can't highly recommend Buzz's books enough. They're amazing, very accessible. His most recent one by the U of A Press, the French, I'm going to get it wrong, French Coast of Arkansas. He's going to be so mad at me for getting it wrong. It's on my book. There it is. Nope, there it is. The Arkansas Approach, the Arkansas Post of Louisiana. Take a look at that. That's the most recent one. Great work on the historical side, and I got to catch him up with the archaeology.
Well, we're running up against 1 o'clock. I want to go ahead and thank you so much, Dr. Beaupre, for doing this for us. It's amazing. There's going to be follow-up questions, I'm sure. Can people find you at the survey site? What do you think?
Absolutely. You can find me at the survey. It's A Beaupre, so ABEAUPRE at uark.edu. And you can find me, there's a UAPB survey Facebook page you can find me through. You know, I'm happy to answer questions and talk about this all day long. It doesn't bother me at all. It's my research, and I love sharing it with the people of Arkansas, quite frankly, because it's people like you that are interested that really kind of get the fire going and keep the fire going for us in the survey. So it's a good thing.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. And don't shut this down yet before you get a chance to read through some of the comments in the chat. There's people singing your praises, right?
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much. And if anybody, I've got a couple minutes, I can stick around if anybody has any questions now, that's totally fine with me.